So it was really this diagram. This is not the exact diagram. In a sense, it's been recreated and replicated, but it's essentially that diagram. And you can see the regression. The regression line shows a negative coefficient. So that's in a sense, that's the basic motivation. And we choose Indonesia, well, partly because we work on Indonesia and Donny is from Indonesia, but it's also because if you look closely at the diagram, Indonesia is one of the exceptions to the proposition that resource-rich economies perform poorly. So you can see Indonesia marked with a red dot. It's one of the strongest performing economies in the Sachs-Warner diagram and our diagram, which is close to it. And you can see it also if you extend the story through to, what do we do? Got the slide. Sorry. Sorry. Thanks, Sarah. So you can see it also if you look at the an update of that diagram for this century, basically for the first 20 years of this century, similar kind of story with caveats, and we're going to talk about those caveats quite a bit in the paper. So that, in a sense, is the intellectual motivation for the paper. Some other points just to emphasise by way of introduction to the topic. First of all, we think this kind of work really has to be comparative, because it's always, as in most topics, it's an outcome compared to what. And so we, instead of looking at all the countries in that diagram, we've deliberately narrowed it down to four countries in this comparative story. Indonesia, with the three comparators being Nigeria, Brazil, and Malaysia. Why do we choose them? It's because they're tropical and because they're middle income, resource-rich economies. Bud, did you have a question?
Include Mexico.
Yeah, so we could have, and in a way it was a bit arbitrary, the choice of countries, Bud, and so in an extension we could easily include Mexico. Mexico is a fair bit richer than the others, except for Malaysia, of course. And it's a bit unusual in the sense that so much of it has this very large manufacturing sector linked to, in a way, the US economy, but it could certainly be included, yeah. Incidentally, on this comparison, the major comparator country historically for Indonesia was, of course, Nigeria, two countries with similar per capita incomes around 1970, the beginning, before the first resource boom. Nigeria a bit richer, a bit stronger in education, and had widely divergent outcomes. There's been a lot of work on these two countries, the comparison, including that famous book by Collier and Bevan. So that's our comparison. We could, as Buddy rightly mentioned, include other countries as well. A bit more on the motivation. Thinking about this topic, it's the story often of resource-rich economies is booms and busts. And it's the busts which are really arguably the most important. It's easy enough to have high growth during a boom period. It's what happens when the commodity prices decline that in a way that tests a country's economic performance. Or as our colleague Ross Garneau rightly put it in that comparative BIS survey a few years ago, the test of a resource country is a test of a resource curse is how a country responds to the boom and the bust. A couple of other points just to note, especially for Indonesia, since Indonesia is the primary focus of our paper. As Indonesian experts would know, Indonesia's actually had two booms. The first boom was really the 1970s. That was a boom focused primarily on the oil sector, to some extent the gas sector. That was the boom when Indonesia had centralized authoritarian government, and the resources essentially flowed through the oil companies, especially Pertamina, to the national government and then spread out through the economy. The second boom, and Donny's thesis focused on this quite a lot, was actually the resource boom this century, and that was a very different one. The commodities were different, no longer oil, but primarily coal, gas, and palm oil, and it occurred in a context of a decentralized democratic Indonesia, and the resource abundance was much more geographically dispersed. So in the paper, we do draw attention to these distinctions, emphasising, in a sense, there's no one resource boom and bust story, and Indonesia illustrates that. Okay, so here's our outline. We introduce the topic. We then provide some backdrop on the resource curse literature in general, some literature review. Then we go into the evidence, especially in section 3, where we look at outcomes. And just to emphasise again, we're studying Indonesia in this paper, largely, apart from interest in the country, largely because it has been one of the better performing resource-rich countries, and we want to know why and how was this outcome. So section 3, in a sense, is the main part of the paper, and then we sum up at the end. So with that introduction, let me now hand over to Donny Pasaribu. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much, Pak, for the opening. As Pak already mentioned, the concept that we're going to discuss today, it's probably a good idea to start with what are they. Of course, a lot of us are already familiar with the idea of resource curse, the Dutch disease, but it's always useful to reflect back on what they are and think about these theories as the framework of how we structure the paper. So first of all, when we think about resource curse, as Pak already mentioned, it's about the idea that economic growth in resource-rich countries tend to be weaker and more volatile than in non-resource rich economies. But what is a resource-rich economy? There are a lot of different definitions. One of the most commonly used is this one, that at least 20% of merchandise export and our fiscal revenue are from non-renewable natural resources. I believe all of the 4 countries that we included in this paper are, included in this definition. But other definitions also include other resource-based product in general. So not necessarily only the resources, but also other resource-intensive products. And another thing when we discuss about natural resource curse or Dutch disease is the idea of a boom. What is a boom? How do we define a boom? Right? In the Dutch disease literature, it's mainly referred to sudden and large increase in foreign exchange earnings, obviously resource earnings, but also to some extent remittances or aid, where it's the foreign exchange earnings is sudden and large, and it's not like gradual increase in export performance. And this is how boom is generally defined in the literature. And as Pak already mentioned, there are many different kinds of boom. Indonesia especially already experienced 2 different kinds of boom. It can vary greatly in scale and intensity, and we will see some evidence of that pretty soon. And each kind of boom have their own policy implications, because there will be different implications of different kinds of booms. Yeah, for Indonesia, again, single commodity mining boom or like oil or other mineral, compared to broad-based agricultural boom, it can be very different in the sense that some literature use the term point source resources that is located in one area, or like diffuse resources that can be everywhere, usually broad-based agricultural boom. And we will discuss about it further later. And about the Dutch disease itself, the natural resource curse evolved out of the Dutch disease literature. So it started by this paper by Corden and Neary. I think it's 1982, was it? Yeah. And it put an emphasis in the real exchange rate appreciation. So to put it simply, the idea is the effect of a natural resource boom is the squeeze in the profitability of the non-booming tradable sector, because imports become suddenly cheaper because the exchange rate appreciated, and or export becomes non-competitive, well, it means that these tradable sectors become non-competitive. They have to contract, right? On the other hand, this also increased the profitability of the non-tradable sectors that do not compete with imported goods. Usually, we think of services here, but this is definition keeps changing. But also real estate and other things that are not competing with imported goods. So we have an economy with three different sectors in the model. There is the booming sector, the resources sector, and then there is this non-booming tradable sector, which have to contract, and the non-tradable sector, which usually expands during this boom. That's the basic model of the Dutch disease. The next part that we will discuss is the conjectures to explain why the resource curves might have happened. There are four here that we included, and we will discuss them one by one, as Paal shows in the outline earlier. The first one is macroeconomic crisis, over borrowing myopia. So the idea here is that a lot of these countries that have natural resources tend to think in the short term, the idea that, today resource prices are very high and we can spend a lot and then even borrow in the expectation that natural resource prices stay high in the future. But then it never stayed that way, right? At some point, resource prices has to decline, and during that period, the booming period, a lot of these countries have rising structural fiscal deficit, and also low quality investment during the boom. But there are variations here. It's not always the pattern. Debt service crisis occurs when commodity prices declines and the reserve has depleted, and can bring other problems that are also included here as the other conjectures. The second one is rising trade protectionism. So as I mentioned earlier, based on the Dutch theory, right, the tradable non-booming sector have to contract, and government tend to want to stop this from happening because it's unpopular. Some people might lose jobs. Manufacturing decline is generally thought of as something bad in the long term. So one of the easiest way, although dangerous way to stop that from happening is, of course, protectionism policies. And Indonesia had some experience of that in the 70s and 80s. But it's not just Indonesia. This pattern happens all over the world. So the second one, it's rising trade protectionism, and also the expansion of state enterprise sector. So some states would like to subsidize these non-booming tradable sectors because of the decline, but they are supposed to be protected. They tend to be heavy industry, but there are a lot of variations in there. The third one is uneven distributional impacts. So in the absence of equitable fiscal measures, these rents from natural resources tend to accrue unevenly, because especially for point source resources that are mining or oil that are only located in very few locations, not everyone can be included, can gain from the boom directly, right? So in developing countries which have problem institutionally, in some cases, only the politically connected can gain direct benefit from these booms. And a lot of cases, it's concentrated to the owner of resources. It can be geographically concentrated. It can also even be ethnically concentrated, because that's where the resources are located. And it can even exacerbate the impact of this can even be exacerbated when the resource price eventually have to decline, right? It's related to the first point, really, because when the government has a lot of fiscal revenue from the resources, they tend to spend on social spendings. But then when the price of resources decline, they have to cut it. And it tends to worsen the distributional impacts of the post-boom crisis episodes. And the last one is also the broadest one, is the institutional deterioration and corrosion. So there are a lot of literature that discuss this, and some of them are beyond economics, really, to explain why and how natural resources can worsen institutional qualities. But especially in countries that have weak institutions to begin with, as you know, large windfall gains, corrupt governance, and undermine some institution. There are like explanations can include the competition to gain rent, because they have to be close to the politicians to get the resources, the gain from resources. Some include even lower investment in education. So there are many ways this can happen. And another one is lack of accountability. Some theorize that when government rely more on natural resource revenue, they rely less on tax income. So there's lack of accountability there to the people. And yeah, it's a really huge literature out there on this topic. Oops. Should we respond now, or how do we easily do it?
Yeah, you could if you.
We just have to unmute you. And maybe if it's just a point of clarification, big questions later.
Yeah, hello, Donny.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, it's Warwick. Hi, Al. I had just a brief question, one issue which you didn't touch on yet. One of the problems with the resource curse literature is it tends to be assuming there's no flow of capital or labour. And so when one sector expands, other sectors have to contract. But of course, if you could expand capital and labour at the same time, then the actual contracting sector doesn't have to contract at all. You just had an expansion at a slower rate than the expanding sector. I wonder if you could comment on why that's not another alternative approach to thinking about the resource curse, is the rigidity of international flows of labour and capital.
Thank you. Should I respond? Do you want to respond?
Up to you, Donny. We can have it later or have it now, whatever you like.
Just quickly, I think that is also related to what sort of policy that are implemented by the government. So this will be also discussed later further. But thank you for the important point. So yeah, huge empirical literature examining these and other issues. And as Pak Hal already mentioned a bit earlier, about Gelb and Associates book in 1988, in which he compared 8 developing countries case studies, including Indonesia. Nigeria also included. This is one of the countries that we discussed in this paper. And in that book, Indonesia was the only country in the sample to implement a determined policy of expenditure reduction and exchange rate realignment before the fading of the second oil boom. So the government at the time were under no illusion that the boom was going to continue forever. There were policies that were implemented to take into account that the boom is only temporary. And more than any other exporters, Indonesia directed a high proportion of its development spending to rural areas for irrigation works, road, and schools. This is also related to how the government spent earlier, as I mentioned, right? There's always the tendency to spend more when you have higher revenue. But in this case, some of those revenue were spent on good spending, you know, irrigation work, road, and school. But obviously there are cases where in Indonesia as well, it was not spent, I wouldn't say correctly, but you know, not in a productive way, such as subsidizing a lot of big state enterprises. And also a central feature of the Collier's bottom billion formulation was the heart of the resource curse is that it makes democracy malfunction. So there's this big focus on the institutional side of the resource curse. So that was about the background, the theory and the framework that we're using to in our paper. Next, let's take a look at the evidence of the resource booms itself. And the first one that we need to see is Indonesia a resource-rich economy? It's not an easy question to answer, right? We thought about using different measures to it, but then we decided on using something relatively simple. That's this one. I'm not sure if it's clear. I hope it is. But we are using this very simple one just to make a point about how resource-rich a country is. And we also include Australia just as a comparator there. So the idea here, we use population density and resource intensity. Population density is just the population per square kilometers. And the idea here is that it's a proxy of resource endowment per capita. So the lower it is, the higher resource endowment per capita is. And Indonesia, it's the second highest compared to Nigeria. So not that resource rich in terms of per capita, but in terms of resource intensity, when we use GDP per square kilometers, Indonesia is moderately rich. Of course, again, this is an imperfect way of looking at it, and we think of land as resources, and there are implications of this because resources can be located anywhere, not all land are the same. But in this case, we're making a point that Indonesia is only moderately resource rich here as compared to Malaysia. It's only like around half of the resource intensity of Malaysia, but compared to Australia, it's around 3 times of Malaysia and Brazil in terms of resource intensity. So the idea here that yes, kind of moderately resource rich economy. Yeah, Paul.
Donny, does that make full sense? Because Malaysia, for example, has a bigger services sector, which is not really resource reliant.
Yeah. Again, there's no perfect way of actually measuring this. How large is the resource endowment in a country is, and we will actually see the implication of not being that dependent on resources later on, because having other sectors which are not directly related to resources is one of the point here. So they may be resources, but are they dependent? That can be a different question, and some of the graphs that we will show you later will also help to answer that. Does it make sense, Paul? Yeah. And the second one is how large have the resource booms been? And for this question, we use natural resource trends from the World Bank estimates. I use this in my thesis as well, and there are some questions about this, but the idea of natural resource trends is it's the value of extracted natural resources subtracted by the cost of extracting them as a percentage of GDP. So it's normalized by the size of GDP. And it also only includes 5 resources: oil, gas, coal, mineral mining, and last one is forestry or timber specifically. Using that metric, we can see here that the size of the boom really differs. So we mentioned about there are 2 booms, right, in the 70s and 80s and 2000s. And in general, the pattern was that natural resource trend as a percentage of GDP has been declining for most countries. And we can also compare the volatility of it. Like for Indonesia, in the first boom happened around 1973 when oil price increased significantly, and that also happened with Nigeria. There's this sudden increase in the natural resource, but mainly from oil for all of this country. And the second episode of the boom was in 1978, and it can show it clearly here. But after that, the natural resource trend as percentage of GDP again declined very quickly after the end of the boom in around the mid-80s. And for all of these countries, especially Indonesia, this percentage keeps on declining throughout the 90s and 80s and 90s. The second boom comparatively is very low, right? Here, we usually use around 2003 or 2004 as the start of the second boom, but the size is not even comparable to the first one. And a bit about the factors about what other sectors are there in the economy, right? As Paul already mentioned earlier. It shows here really how some countries are very much reliant on resources throughout the period, such as Nigeria, because the volatility, and again, this is measured as a percent of GDP. It shows that for Nigeria, it's always been a big factor in its economy, and it can increase, it can double or triple in 1 year and then decline very suddenly, very quickly in the next year. It shows how dependent it is on natural resources trend. But for Indonesia, for Malaysia, it's much less volatile in a sense compared to Nigeria. And Brazil is very interesting because it's never reached that high level of natural resource trends. We think it's mainly because of they do not include agriculture or plantation-based resources here. But we can visibly see there is some increase in the second boom from the 2003 and up until the mid 2010s. So some key takeaways here: the major boom from Indonesia was in the 1970s, much larger than the second boom. And the volatility of the rand, as I mentioned, both upsides and downside. Hence, in the 80s, in many commodity exporters, it's called the lost decades. Another way to look at it is using the percentage of natural resource export as total export. Here, we can select our own what are included. So natural resources here are defined as this. It's the same definition that are used by Sachs and Warner in the very first graph that we showed earlier. So as we can clearly see here, up until 1980 or mid-1980, more than 90% of Indonesia's export were natural resources based on this definition, right? But then very, very quickly it declined because the country diversified to many other sectors, especially manufacturing. And that also happened in other economies that we include here, especially Malaysia and also Brazil. But that did not really happen for Nigeria. We don't really know what happens in the middle. There's no data for them. But we can assume that it's always above 90% for Nigeria here. So this is another way to look at it. And we can clearly see also the second boom here, much more clear than when we see in terms of resource rent, because the second boom here really, so there's this resource, like moving out of resources in the 80s, but then moving back into resources in the 2000s. Next part that when we look at the boom is also important to disaggregate the resource boom over time. Which resources are more relevant, especially when we think about Indonesia, the two booms are very different. So this is the proportion of different kinds of rents that are included in the natural resource rents. As we can see here, in the 70s and 80s, it's majority oil. 80% more of Indonesia natural resource rent came from oil. And during the moving away out of resources, diversified to other source of resources. But one interesting point here is the second boom, right? Coal was not a thing before the 2000s. It's only in the last 20 years that coal become such a big thing. And the increase in coal was very rapid. And there are a lot of literature to discuss why it might have happened. But our focus here in the second boom is that it's not oil anymore, and all of the other resources also contribute, but mostly in this case is coal. However, again, we can't include palm oil here, so it's even more diverse than what we are seeing now here. So the second boom, in combination of the two graphs earlier, it's smaller, more diffuse, geographically dispersed trends in the democratic era, and it also has important political economy implications. There are two other things that I want to show in terms of how we look at resource boom. And the first one is terms of trade. Terms of trade is, to put it simply, is the price of export as compared to the price of import. And this is the terms of trade index, and it's 100 in the year 2000 as an index. And as we can see here, there are like two big groups. We can see Indonesia and Nigeria are very similar, especially in the first boom, right? It started in the 72, 73, the first spike here, and then the second one here, and then there's some decline after the boom there. And the other group, Malaysia and Brazil, they were never that volatile, while Indonesia become less volatile after that. Even this line actually just, you know, plateaued there and then increased during the second boom. But look at Nigeria, the volatility stays there, and even worse during the second boom. This again shows that, you know, some countries were able to diversify to other sectors, not just, you know, relying on resources throughout the whole period. But in this case, Nigeria were not able to do that. And in fact, it shows in the volatility, which has a lot of implications on its macroeconomic management, and as we will see later, in inflation and economic growth. And this should be seen at the same time as the terms of it, this real exchange rate, the measure that we use when we discuss about the Dutch disease, right? And we have to cut it at 200 because otherwise we won't be able to see the movement in the other countries. But for Nigeria case, it's so high there that we can't really include in the graph anymore. But similar pattern can be observed here. So some of the pattern here, the appreciation throughout the 70s, and then the briefly rose again in the 80, 81 in response to the second smaller price oil shock. And also we can see three significant depreciation events. The 1978 and the 1983 devaluation can be clearly seen here, and also it was in the context of a fixed exchange rate regime, and also the rupiah's collapse in the 1997 and 1998 here in the Asian financial crisis. Other than that, it looks stable, but during the second boom, there's this gradual increase, but again, the size is much smaller if we compare it to the first boom. And when we look at other countries, like especially Malaysia, there's this stability that it's not really moving that much. But Brazil, there's this volatility where it shows how important macroeconomic management is. And as we will see later when we discuss about inflation in Brazil, this is a big problem for Brazil. Yeah, that's it from my part. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Donny, and hello again. I'm back. So now we're looking at the outcome story. So just to connect the previous slide to this part of the paper, the behaviour of the real exchange rate of the four countries gives you already an insight into the nature of the macroeconomic management response to the boom. In particular, Indonesia and Malaysia, reflecting their economic management histories at much more stable real exchange rates, moving with the terms of trade, but much more stable compared to Nigeria, especially, and also Brazil. Okay, so let's move on to look at some of the outcomes and to see how the countries performed as a result of the booms. So they're mainly conventional outcomes. I should mention, by the way, and apologies especially to Buddy and Paul and others, we're not really looking at environmental management. That's a big topic, but it's a separate topic from this paper. It's really the economic and social dimensions of booms. So first of all, just the first indicator economists tend to look at is long-term economic growth during the boom periods. So here's the, what have I done wrong here? Sorry, I've got to click. Okay, thanks. Thanks. Sorry if I wasn't, hello to people online. Sorry if I wasn't looking at the right camera. So the first look at it is just what's happened to long-term economic growth in the 4 countries. And clearly two things stand out. First of all, it's the 2 Southeast Asian economies outperforming the other 2, and Indonesia grew strongly pretty much throughout the period, except for 1997-98 Asian financial crisis. Notable especially was that it grew strongly during the 1980s, which was in a sense a lost decade for a lot of commodity exporters who were really hit by this confluence of declining commodity prices and rising global interest rates, causing a deep macroeconomic crisis in many countries. So that's the first point. On this, in a sense, a basic economic indicator, Indonesia has performed strongly. And that's why, of course, back to the original Sachs-Warner diagram, it's up fairly high in the growth on the performance indicator. Second indicator is, in a sense, the stability of Indonesian and Malaysian economic growth compared to especially Nigeria and Brazil. And this is partly the management of the resource boom and partly reflects both countries' long-term economic trajectory of volatile economic growth. So that's the first basic indicator. Indonesia, one of the few commodity exporters to manage, especially the first boom, the 1980s, when commodity prices declined. So second indicator is just what's happened to the macroeconomic management and response during and after the booms. And this is also an important feature. It links back to the exchange rate story, which Donny showed you earlier. And the point just to emphasize here is that basically Indonesia, since the 1960s hyperinflation, has been essentially an inflation-averse economy, at least moderately so. And that's shown in these inflation figures. Both Nigeria and Brazil at various stages lost control of their macroeconomy, and that explains the wild variations in the real exchange rate, that is the lack of adjustment to relative prices or the over-adjustment. So that gives us a clue already that the macroeconomic management during the resource booms and the busts was effective. And we just choose inflation, we could choose other indicators and you'd get a fairly similar story. So that's the inflation story. That's also the exchange rate story. In a sense, you could argue that Indonesia avoided severe exchange rate misalignment. And for non-economists, that's a rather abstract, boring statement, but it really is quite important in economic management. By the way, we're putting aside some of the technicalities of real exchange rate management. Quite a lot's been done on that topic within this department, including people like Peter Waugh and Ross Garneau. So we're abstracting from a lot of detailed measurement conceptual issues when we're talking about the real exchange rate. We're using, for those who are interested, the Bruegel database, which is a widely used real exchange rate database series. So that's the economic growth story, the macroeconomic management story. Related to the macroeconomic management story is what happens to fiscal policy. And in some ways, this is, apart from the exchange rate story, it's probably the most important part of the economic management of a resource boom. That is what countries do with the resource windfall gains, whether they save it, offshore, which has implications for the exchange rate, whether they invested productively or wastefully. And so it's quite hard to get that sort of data. You need very detailed investment data, which we haven't got in this paper, which we may do as an extension. The first boom period, as was mentioned in the quotes from the Gelb et al. Study, did actually do that. It looked quite carefully at the quality of public investment spending during the first boom, and that's where Indonesia came out fairly well. We haven't got that sort of data for the second boom. We may be able to get it, but as a proxy, we can at least look at fiscal policy. That is, was fiscal prudence maintained during the booms and during the busts? So ideally, you'd want counter-cyclical fiscal policy. You'd want small deficits or possible fiscal surpluses during the boom period for saving for the bust period. And so that gives us an indicator of at least the first line of response in fiscal policy. What happens to the macro balances? Second issue is how the money is spent. So the story clearly for Indonesia, at least we have the data from 1990 onwards. It's actually quite hard to get comparative budget data way back to the 70s, 80s, which we'll do at some stage. So these are fiscal balances as a percent of GDP for the four countries over time. And you can see basically the story is one of Indonesia pretty consistently being a fiscally prudent government, both in the Soeharto period and in the democratic period. And in a sense that series gives us insights into the capacity of countries to manage a resource boom, at least one important aspect of it. So you can see generally that Indonesia and Malaysia are more fiscally prudent most of the time compared to Brazil and Nigeria. Brazil, of course, in particular, has had a history of macroeconomic crises, and Nigeria has during the boom as well. So that's the first point to note. Second point to note, just looking at Indonesia more closely, this is from 1980 onwards, is that you do see some element of counter-cyclical fiscal policy during the democratic era. Not so much the Soeharto era, where, of course, in any case, there was a lot of off-budget government expenditure. So, but you can see from this graph, at least, where we compare the commodity export price index for Indonesia, that's the red line, with the bars, which are the budget deficits or surpluses. So you can see when commodity prices began to strengthen early part of this century, the government ran pretty small fiscal deficits, sort of 1%, 1.5%. And when the commodity prices began to fall, around about 2013, 14, those balances actually increased. There was increased fiscal deficit. So in a sense, you can see at work some kind of moderate counter-cyclical fiscal policy, tending to be more cautious on spending during the booms and spending more during the lower commodity prices. So that gives us some indication, at least, of in a bit more detail of Indonesia's fiscal management response. Okay, so that's the fiscal story. As I say, we need more on how countries invest the boom. The quality of investment is really, I think, a crucial indicator. Quite hard to get. Okay, so that's the second part of the response. Third part is consistent with that analytical framework which Donny laid out earlier. The third part is what's happened to trade policy. And we know, again, the story is very often of countries going protectionist for the reasons Donny mentioned during resource booms. That is the Dutch disease effect and the political pressure to protect the contracting non-boom tradable sectors. So what's the story for these four countries? Well, again, big topic, and we don't go into all the detail of it, but the essential story is fairly straightforward, and it is quite neatly summarised in, again, another paper of this famous combination, Sachs and Warner, where they had these binary estimates of closed or open economies. You can use a lot of other indicators. We did experiment with them, and they don't really tell a fundamentally different story. But the Sachs-Warner so-called always open indicator tells us quite a lot. And what it tells us is that basically Indonesia was on that classification an open economy pretty much continuously during both booms. It doesn't mean, of course, it was a really open economy. We know the story of especially the 1970s, late 70s, and more recently of a lot of protectionist pressure. But on this basic indicator, Indonesia remained open throughout, as of course did Malaysia. Malaysia was one of the only countries always open throughout the period in the Sachs-Warner study. And the comparison with Brazil and Nigeria and many other developing countries is quite instructive. Nigeria remained closed throughout the period. Brazil technically became open in the early 1990s. And you can see from this summary table when the country's so-called economic openness started. And so that's another part of the story, that we know that generally more open economies tend to grow more strongly over the long term. And that tells us basically that Indonesia, one of the reasons for Indonesia performing more strongly was the fact that it remained open throughout the period. And again, open with qualifications. Okay, so that's the, that's the trade policy story. A lot of work being done, of course, on Indonesian trade policy in this department. The best volume, in a way, is the update volume edited by Acho and Mario Pangestu and Dede, but lots of other work as well. So that's the trade policy story. So we're already beginning to accumulate some evidence of why Indonesia performed better. It's partly the macroeconomic story, it's partly the trade policy story. What about distributional impacts? As Donny mentioned, that's an important part of the story in trying to understand the resource boom outcomes. So big picture, big story, big picture, and you can't really attribute distributional outcomes to a single factor that is the resource boom. There are many other factors at play, but at least we want to get a sense of what happened to living standards in these countries during the boom and bust period. We spent a lot of time on a lot of indicators. We did look at quite a lot, which we don't present here, but we focus mainly on the poverty and inequality story. There's an interesting side story on things like education, because it's part of that resource curse literature. The tendency is for resource-rich countries to underinvest in education because they think they can just grow through natural resource exploitation. So we put aside that, although we could include it, and the conclusion is fairly similar. But the basic story is a well-known one, which is that Indonesia's poverty has declined almost continuously since the late 1960s, when we've been able to measure it accurately, except for the Asian financial crisis. One or two other years where poverty probably didn't decline, but they were very minor and one-off years. So the basic story is Indonesia in the red dots, and its poverty has been declining consistently. Hasn't been declining as fast this century as the previous century, partly because its economic growth has been slower. But compared to these four countries, Indonesia's poverty record clearly is very strong. Malaysia is a separate case in a way, because it's always had fairly high income and therefore fairly low poverty. But compared to Brazil and Nigeria, you can see that this is the POVCAL data, by the way, which is the standardized World Bank poverty estimates. We could go back further for Indonesia, but we don't get the comparative story. So you see basically in the early 1980s, Indonesia actually had higher headcount poverty than Nigeria and a lot higher than Brazil. By just before the COVID crisis, Indonesian poverty way below that of Nigeria, and actually not far off Brazil's, even though Brazil's still a richer country. So there's clearly a poverty outcome story, which shows Indonesia's superior performance to the others. The inequality story isn't so clear. Indonesia on these indicators had relatively low to moderate inequality. in the 80s. Some conjecture, of course, about the quality of the data, but that's the comparative data from the BPS, the Susanas Household Survey. Inequality, as we know, has risen in Indonesia during this century, for most of this century. And so that's shown in this graph, the red dots for Indonesia. It's still lower than Brazil, but it's somewhat higher than Nigeria and even Malaysia. So the bottom line basically is almost all the poverty decline has come from economic growth, not from the inequality outcomes. So that's just a very quick sort of summary, but it is telling us again that the poverty story has been pretty good for Indonesia, and that in a sense has feedback responses to the rest of the story, which is tending to have more stable polities as well. Indonesia hasn't yet had a coup and hasn't yet had a President Bolsonaro, for example. So that's basically the story. Just one note, in a sense, perhaps a note of irony, is that Indonesia's Gini, the inequality measure, was broadly stable during the first boom. Remember, that was the boom for non-Indonesian specialists. That was the boom of centralized, authoritarian, in a sense, military-dominated rule. But that was paradoxically the time when arguably the most productive investments from the windfall gains from the oil boom occurred. That is, as Donny mentioned, the big investments in infrastructure, rural infrastructure, roads and schooling and so on. Paradoxically, the Gini rose during the second boom, the democratic era of decentralized government, geographically dispersed natural resource endowments as well. So we're not arguing that's because of the resource boom, it's just to, in a sense, highlight one small irony in the story. Okay, final part of the story is what's happened to institutional effects. Again, huge topic, and the real insights, I think, come from the country studies, the narratives of what's happened to countries and their political institutional system over time. There's a big literature on that, especially for a country like Nigeria. That's the Collier, Bevan and others' work. But for the comparison, we've just tried to stick to these comparative indicators. As we know, there are a lot of them. As we also know, they're subjective and they need to be interpreted with caution. But just as a sort of broad story, we use the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, approximate data, but it's really telling us a bit of a story, and that is that over time on this indicator, this institutional indicator, Indonesia has generally progressed more than the comparator countries. We looked at other indicators. There's a very widely used thing called the World Governance Indicators, lots of others. They tend to tell a similar story. And of course, part of the governance story for Indonesia was the big story of transition from authoritarian to democratic rule. But at least on this kind of indicator, it's just giving us a bit more evidence that there hasn't really been any notable institutional deterioration during the booms, and probably an improvement. And that's in comparison to other countries, notably Nigeria and Brazil. Okay, summing up. It's time for summing up. We have three main conclusions. First one is that Indonesia's managed its resource abundance relatively well. Emphasising again, we're abstracting from considerations related to the quality of environmental management. It's really just the economic and social impacts of the resource booms, not their environmental management, on which people in this room are much better qualified to talk. But that's the first point. On the comparisons, back to that table figure 1 and figure 2 from Sachs-Warner, it's just confirming the story that Indonesia's managed it relatively well. We argue it's principally because of its largely prudent macroeconomic management, staying largely open most of the time. And it has, especially in the first boom, but to some extent both booms, there has been some reasonably effective recycling of the proceeds of the boom into infrastructure and so on. Importantly, it's been aided by what you might call a fairly settled polity and governance, both periods. In the first boom period, in a sense, Soeharto was in control by then. And the second boom, the democratic system had really been established and was sort of credible and functioning well. So there wasn't this sort of deep political uncertainty in either period. We're not talking about human rights here, by the way. We're just talking about having a reasonably settled sort of political system. Second point, just to emphasise, Indonesia could have managed the resource booms better, quite a bit better. It could have saved more of the proceeds of the booms in both periods. It would have made the macroeconomic adjustment easier. It could have actually got more benefit fiscally from the booms through more efficient taxation procedures, better regulation. Instead of going for resource nationalism, it could have taxed the booms more effectively, and that would have been a benefit for spending the proceeds. But so it could have done better, clearly. The third point, just to emphasise, is the difference between the two periods, which we've talked about quite a bit. And it just illustrates the general point that there's no such thing as a resource boom and bust. Each country is different because the commodity composition of the booms are different, the duration of the booms are different, and the institutional arrangements governing them are also different. Okay, thank you very much. We'll stop there. Look forward to comments. This is the first time we presented this paper, and we very much welcome comments on it. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Hal and Donny. So we're going to Q&A now. So for online audience, if you have a question, can you just raise hand? Should we start with the chat box first? Because they have. So Hal, please.
Okay. You want to online?
Should I read them out? And
No, everyone can see them. People online can see them.
they can see them too. So maybe.
Donny, why don't you have a go, and I'll follow up. Is that right?
So the first one, yeah, Singapore will be very resource intensive by this measure. I think it refers to the first graph. This one, right?
No, the table where you have GDP per kilometre square.
Oh,
It's also the first one, I think, Paul, because Singapore's exports do include oil and stuff from Indonesia and Malaysia being processed in Singapore. A point that Chandra made, by the way, commenting.
yeah. We do not include Singapore there, but yeah, if we refer to the first graph, which was again here, it's because of the definition, right? Because there are a lot of oil processing in Singapore. So to some extent, using that definition of resource intensive goods, it is yeah, kind of resource intensive, which doesn't really make sense, but that's the definition that we decide on, because a lot of country would be their dependence on natural resources need to be taken into account the processing, at least the basic processing of those resources. So yeah, again, it's not a perfect measure, but yeah, that's the definition that we use.
And we could drop Singapore.
Yeah, we can definitely drop Singapore and change. Yeah. Evidence suggests that there is a difference between the resource boom in the 70s and the 2000s, given the different term of trade resulting. Can one assume the latter is more preferable to the former? What do you think, Pat?
So thanks. That's from Matthew, isn't it? Hi, Matthew. Thanks for the question. Is it more preferable? Are we talking normative or positive? In a sense, you could argue that a more diverse resource boom is easier to manage because it's going to be less volatile because you've got more diversified export structure and not all commodity prices move in the same direction. In a way, the virtue of the first boom was you had a strongly development-oriented government. And so the proceeds were basically going from the oil sector through the state-owned oil company Pertamina or through foreign companies and then being taxed, all going to the central government, which actually had a development agenda of spreading resources out throughout the country. So it sort of depends on the institutional and political arrangements. But the general point is, I guess, the more diversified the basis of a boom, the easier it is to manage because there's probably going to be less volatility.
I guess one point that I would add is the fact that Indonesia has diversified quite a lot before the second boom started, right? So it was much more ready that during the second boom, it's not only reliant on that natural resource sector, there are already other quite large sectors in the economy.
Which is, if I can do that again, which is an important point, because it does go to the question of exchange rate management. So the Indonesian history is very clear on that. Indonesia had a fixed exchange rate regime through the 70s until 1978. It then had a fixed but adjustable exchange rate regime. Then it moved to a float after the Asian financial crisis. During the late 1970s, the economic managers of Indonesia saw the end of the boom coming, arguably, and they then went for a big exchange rate devaluation, November 1978, on the premise that they needed to restore the competitiveness to the non-booming tradable sectors, especially manufacturing, but also some of agriculture. Unfortunately, when you're trying to time exchange rate devaluations, you can't always get it right. And that was just before a mini boom of the shown in the resource spreads graph, another mini oil price boom. And so that was nullified almost immediately through the real exchange rate. But the 1980s, the two big devaluations had a major impact on the diversification of the economy, as Donny said, and that led to this very strong export manufacturing boom for about a decade. Yep, thanks. So we've got more questions here, I think.
Would the difference in the composition of natural resource and changes in the exchange rate regime will affect the curves? The change in the exchange rate regime. I think you somehow already kind of addressed that as well, right? Yeah. Yeah. So definitely it matters. Yeah. And as Pak Hal already mentioned earlier, it has some effects. You want to add something, Pak? No?
Yeah, no, actually, Pak Chato, selamat siang. Nice to hear from you from Jogja. Yeah, I think that's, as Donny mentioned, I think that's an important point. A more diversified commodity boom is by definition going to be easier to manage just because you get less volatility because of this more diversified export structure. And that goes back in a way partly to a question I think Paul had about the Malaysian story, which is not just the more diversified commodity export structure, but a bigger services sector as well. So the more diversified the economy, the easier it is to manage a boom and bust. When you're in Nigeria, as those graphs showed, Nigeria had a really difficult time trying to manage its boom and bust because it was just so dependent on oil. So thanks very much, Pak Chatur, and mudah-mudahan semua baik di Jogja. We got another one as well.
From Khairaja. When comparing Nigeria with Indonesia on the trade policy reform, being an important member of ASEAN is crucial for Indonesia's trade policy reform, while Nigeria did not have such pleasure. Yeah, it's a really important point, the participation in ASEAN, and ASEAN being it's not really a trade bloc, but it always being open to trade with members, non-members outside of the group. In fact, I think in Bu Mari's paper, that's one of the reasons why Indonesia can stay being open after the 1997-98 reform, basically because Indonesia are already within this agreement that it's going to stay open. So it's a big factor influencing that Indonesia stay open during the second boom.
Yeah, I think so. Hi, Kali. How are you, mate? And thanks for your question. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Indonesia has the benefit of being in a very open region within ASEAN, but also broadly in East Asia. Nigeria doesn't have that benefit. And arguably Brazil until recently hasn't either. So yeah, important point. Thanks, Kali. I think there's a question up there. Do you want to take it?
Yeah, please take it.
Yeah, is that right?
Yeah, sure.
I have two questions. The first one, I'm just wondering,
Hello, Dika.
is the fuel subsidy a common, like, typical policy in all these resource-rich countries? Like you have comparison with Malaysia, Brazil, Nigeria. And that's the first one. And then the second one, I'm just wondering, what's the share of resource exports in terms of of oil versus palm oil. That Indonesia now rely more on palm oil in terms of their exports revenue. So it means that Indonesia keeps on giving the fuel subsidy, which benefits middle income and upper middle income from the revenue that is actually going down instead of going up, but trying to keep up with that fuel subsidy from the revenue from the palm oil.
I guess I'll try to address the second question first, right? So it's more about the export composition of Indonesia between coal and palm oil. Actually, I haven't really checked the last figures, but from memory, it's of comparable size nearly always between coal and palm oil. The difference is, like, with palm oil, it's not exactly categorized as resource, which, you know, it's taxed just as any other businesses, right? Except for the export tax. The government do not really extract any specific tax from there, but because coal is a natural resources, there are some other arrangement fiscally, especially with the local government as well. So that's one part of it. About the, what was the second part? I'm really sorry.
About petroleum prices and subsidy. The first question you mentioned.
Yeah, from what fuel subsidy, yeah, from what I know, yeah, all of these countries have fuel subsidy with varying degrees. It's always a big political issue in all oil producing countries. So it's a common thing everywhere. Do you want to add something?
So thanks, Dega. Very important questions. And hello to your able assistant. I can see next to you. For those who can't see Dega, she's got her daughter here during school holidays. So I think first question, if I understand correctly, Dega, it's important. So what we could do, we perhaps should do, is to have a petroleum price of the 4 countries throughout the period. So all the countries have wrestled with whether you subsidise petroleum prices or not. Indonesia has very much so. Sometimes the petroleum subsidy has been as much as almost a quarter of the budget. It's the worst, but it's been a recurring issue, and it's of course becoming an issue again this year as oil prices go up. So we could actually put a petroleum price series in for the 4, and I think it would show that Nigeria has had consistently really cheap petroleum, and I think Brazil has too, I'm not sure, and Malaysia and Indonesia have been closer to market prices, therefore the subsidies have been smaller. And that's important because it's about how to manage the proceeds of a windfall gain, whether it ends up in subsidies or really low quality public investments or Swiss bank accounts versus investing in productive, infrastructure, rural development, schools and hospitals and so on. So that's, thanks, we could do that. Have we answered the second question?
Yes, much.
So the second question is actually about oil versus palm oil.
Oh, yeah.
So instead of coal, your explanation was about coal. My question is about like oil versus palm oil.
So yeah, in this presentation, we did not include the detail. I usually have it, but not for this one. This is the graph that shows the natural resources composition, right? And in this graph, we include both palm oil, oil and gas, and a bunch of other natural resources. But because we don't include it directly, I can't really say much. But definitely for oil, the rent from oil has been declining consistently. I'm not sure if we can say it's been replaced by palm oil, but it certainly has been declining, and all other natural resources here can be said as replacing the role of oil there. And there are many reasons of why that has happened, but one particularly important part is coal here. Yes, that's all I can say.
Can I just add one small point we glossed over, didn't talk about much, and that is just what's included in the estimates of the natural resource rents. And in particular, the question of, in principle, you'd expect, as Donny said, it would be just non-renewable natural resources. In fact, as was shown, in fact, in this graph here, forestry is included in the World Bank estimates of resource rents, but palm oil isn't. And arguably, they really should be treated the same way, I would have thought. That is, you can have them they're both potentially renewable natural resources. So there is a qualification, as Donny mentioned. Arguably, the second resource boom for Indonesia is understated because of the exclusion of palm oil. So questions of definitions do matter. Palm oil is in the export shares, but not in the resource shares. Yeah.
Any possible question on raise hand? Participants?
Oh, participants? Go to the result. Oh,
Okay.
not here anymore.
Any more questions from the audience?
Yes, and Donny, thank you for the presentation. So the first one is comment. If we include country that is not rich of natural resources like Thailand, wouldn't be able to compare better? What is actually country with natural resources what have missed throughout the year compared to those who do not have any much natural resources, and also what is the benefit of country who got natural resources comparing those who do not get, because it doesn't always be negative, I guess. Second issue is I think we don't talk much the story of changing of economic structure after the boom, which probably tell a lot of story about the outcome that you discussed, and also what are exactly the policies among those implemented at the end of the boom that actually trigger those structural changes. So that's probably an interesting discussion. And third is just a small comment. If we think about comparison between boom caused by oil and gas and boom caused by coal, there is a bit paradox over here. So the way that we extract coal, oil and gas is government monopoly. So everything is extracted by the government. So there is a possibility of bad income inequality, because basically the opportunity of a problem of leader that goes wrong. While coal by nature, there are a lot of people working on that sector, and particularly in Indonesia, the coal mining always accompanied by people mining as well. So in terms of distribution, just because of the mechanism that how we extract it, more people actually could enjoy it, but it's not showing on the poverty or in the inequality. So what exactly going on? And the other thing is also on illegal activities. You know, oil and gas is very difficult to get in illegal activities. Yes, there are, but in a large scale you cannot. Well, coal you could get a large scale illegal activities. So then, yeah.
Sorry, but what was the second point? I got the first one, I got the third. What was the middle one again? Sorry.
About what is it?
Your second question. Sorry, I only started writing this.
The story on how the economy changed its structure.
Yeah.
And I think that is important in explaining the outcome.
Yep. Really important points.
Yeah. You want to say something?
Okay, please come in too, Donny. So thanks for there, as always, really pertinent question. So putting in resource poor countries or countries in the middle like Thailand, yeah, it's just that we're trying to restrict it to the resource rich cases, because if it just becomes a general story, in a sense, we're independent of resource abundance, I'm not sure how we can manage it, but let us think about that. I mean, the quintessential resource poor success stories were, of course, the original 5 East Asian economies, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. And the argument there was clear, I guess, that countries knew the only way they could achieve economic and social development was to actually focus on their human resources, because they had no natural resources, relatively speaking. So that drove a lot of the good economic and social outcomes. But Broadening it, I don't know. We'll ask you later whether we're missing something. Second point, yeah, the structural change in the wake of the commodity boom and bust, and then how that affects another round. That's a really interesting question, and that was obviously uppermost in the minds of the Wijoyo et al. Technocrats in the 70s with the big devaluation of 1978, because they could see the end of the boom coming and they were worried about the loss of competitiveness in manufacturing. That's a difficult question, isn't it? Because the extent to which, so the argument for doing something like that is that a more diversified economy, as you're saying, means that it can manage the shocks of a sudden decline in commodity prices. Incidentally, in the Global Economic Prospects Seminar, which presented in this series by the World Bank Group in, when was it, February or March, in the Karma series, the speaker, Ayan Koze, actually emphasised the fact that Indonesia was singled out as a country which had a more diversified economic structure, and that's an obvious benefit. I mean, the counter argument there is how much do you get involved in kind of implicit de facto industry policy? That is, how much do you try and anticipate future price changes, and then you try and guide, the incentives accordingly. So I think that's not an easy, that's a conundrum in a sense, especially when you get really big volatility. I mean, one clear policy prescription is to do as much as possible of neutralising the impact of commodity booms, through sovereign wealth funds or saving money offshore or investing it directly in productive resources to help the non-booming tradable sectors. But whether you get involved in exchange rate manipulation, for example, trying to manage your way through resource, but big question, especially in the era of floating exchange rates. You can do a bit, of course. Countries are doing it because they're trying to nullify the effects of commodity of short-term capital surges both ways. So yeah, big question. Final point. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So coal, gas and oil, they're, as you say, big, obvious production units, a lot less illegal activity. There might be illegal activity for the proceeds, but not actually from the production itself. And palm oil at the other extreme has a lot more smallholder, and therefore the benefits by definition are more likely to be distributionally wider. And coal is somewhere in the middle, I guess, isn't it? It's some very large coal projects which it's much more difficult, I guess, to engage in illegality, but a lot of the small-scale coal, which I remember well from the fieldwork you did with Chris Manning and Ross Garneau from memory when you was at South Sumatra or somewhere, and there was pretty widespread illegality in the small-scale coal, as I understand it. I hope I'm not misquoting you on that. And forestry is in some ways analogous, isn't it? We know forestry is much more difficult to control the rents. But yeah, thanks. Donny, do you want to add something?
Yeah, especially on the last point, because in my third dissertation paper, that's one of the topics I try to compare the difference in coal and palm oil boom at the district level, right? And in both cases, coal and palm oil helped to eradicate poverty, lower the poverty rate. But I didn't really look into the inequality side of it because it's harder to do that. But also, when you look at wage and the kind of employment that are created, at least according to what I remember, palm oil boom creates a lot of low-paying jobs. But in terms of coal, it created jobs, but in a smaller number, but more of a high-paying side. That can contribute to part of the inequality story, but again, there are a lot of other things that happened at the same time. So yeah, that's all I want to add.
Maybe another Josh in the chat.
I think this is related to Pak Budi question as well, to include DACC's story, especially manufacturing performance, in the discussion from Daisy. why did you include the STC story, especially manufacturing performance, in the discussion? So that is an important point that we might we'll think about how to discuss that. But yeah,
it's in the exchange rate story.
it is in the exchange rate story, yeah, and to some extent in the export story as well, the resource and non-resource export. But we didn't really go into the detail because it's a whole lot of literature and topic that we can explore so much deeper. Warwick?
And also, just to say, hi, Daisy, apa khabar? Mudah-mudahan semua baik di Bapenas. Yeah, Warwick, do you want to answer? I don't know whether Warwick's still there. Warwick, are you still there? Yeah. We can't hear you. Can you unmute, Warwick?
It's all right, I can unmute now. I was being blocked. I want to come back to this question of why you need to have macroeconomic management when you have these sort of commodity booms. It's really because if you have a fixed amount of capital and labor in the economy and you get a boom in one sector, then another sector really has to contract. Now, if in fact you allow capital and labor to flow across borders, then you don't necessarily have a macroeconomic management problem to the same extent. And one of the things I found in your presentation that was interesting was openness matters. And openness, if I understand the measurement, includes capital mobility, capital access to capital. So what you might be picking up is the fact it's not the trade itself, it's the fact that international capital can flow in when there's a boom to finance the construction that doesn't require domestic capital, and therefore you don't get quite the same Dutch disease problem. So I'm wondering if what you're picking up is actually this issue of international capital flows. I doubt there's much labour mobility across borders, although in some countries there is, because you bring in a lot of, in Middle East countries, for example, you bring in a lot of guest workers to help manage the resources boom. So I just wonder whether you're picking up stuff which relates to this fundamental problem of whether you allow international capital to flow or not. Whether you had any comments on that, because I don't think you're controlling for that at all.
Yeah, Warwick, thanks very much. Really important issue you've raised. So just trying to unpack it a bit, the labour mobility story, as I think you mentioned, is not a feature of these economies. It is, as you say, the Middle Eastern economies and others. East Timor too, by the way. So lots of internal labour mobility for Indonesia, but very little international labour mobility. And I'm pretty sure, and of course Malaysia has huge international labour mobility. About a third of its workforce is foreign workers. But for the other two, I don't think there's as much. So that's the labour story. The capital story, have to think about that. So I guess during the booms, there's plenty of capital inflow to accompany the booms. I'm not sure how I think the Sachs-Warner estimate of openness, it has those 6 variables as measures of openness. I don't think there's a capital openness measure in it, but I could be wrong. So question is, what would we use as an indicator of capital openness? And the person we'd ask would be Professor Warwick McKibben. So that'd be interesting to know. We should explore it. I guess the question is, different kinds of capital probably matter too, don't they? That is, the FDI, which comes into a resource-rich economy, presumably is going to be reasonably fixed. That is, they'll be investing in particular projects which will remain. When it's short-term capital flows, which are pretty volatile and which can quickly leave the country, which of course happen, as we know, especially in Nigeria, have to think about that as well. So Indonesia has had an open capital account throughout the period. We'd have to check on Nigeria and Brazil. My guess is probably not. And Malaysia has been, except for a period after the Asian financial crisis, open capital account. So Warwick, if you're still listening, what measure of capital openness would you use?
Okay, thanks.
Did you get my question?
Yeah, I did. No. I keep getting muted, so I'm now unmuted. Yeah, it's not so much. I guess my point is that you might be attributing good macro management to a country that's actually didn't have much macro management to do because the capital markets were able to do a lot of the adjustment. One of the reasons Australia's and reason Ross Garner sort of overestimated how bad the Dutch disease would be for Australia during the commodity boom is because the model didn't allow international capital and labour mobility. Once you allow for that, then you get a totally different story. And so I wonder how much you're identifying as good macro management is really that the adjustment of international capital and labour has meant you didn't have to do as much macro management in countries that are more open. And so you've got to identify the issue.
Okay.
The second point I'd raise is Buddy's point, which I think is really important. If you want to identify something, you really do need a country in there that doesn't actually have the resources boom because you're attributing too much to the resources outcome. So you need to identify it. And I think Buddy's suggestion is a really important one.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. We will think about that point. It's important. So on the first point, Warwick, so that if the labour market story is not a big part of it, we look at the capital market story. What indicator would you use for capital openness? Oh, sorry. We're getting there, Warwick.
Yeah, sorry about that. Well, even actually, you could even use the size of the current account, or the capital account might be another indicator because that gives you some idea of how much capital is flowing across the board. But I actually don't know specifically, but you must have information on not just how much capital is flowing in, but the composition.
Yep. Okay, that's
anyway, it's something to think about.
Thanks. That's very useful. And likewise, the second point related back to Buddy's point. Yeah, thanks, Warwick.
Sorry, unfortunately, we're running out of time. So sorry for people who haven't already asked their questions. Maybe you can send them an email later. But thank you so much for.
Can Peter Ward quick
Okay, Peter.
Because he knows this topic well.
I'll find Peter.
Sorry. Peter, we're coming to you.
Can you unmute, Peter? I have clicked it.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
You are indeed, and we can see you as well.
Right. Thank you very much to Hal and Donny for the presentation. I just have one very quick question about slide number 28 on the Gini coefficient. Lots of people have tried to explain the increase in inequality that has been observed from Indonesia based on Susanas. And so far as I know, no one succeeded, though if anyone has a different view about that, I'd love to hear from them. Please send me an email telling me who has successfully explained the increase in inequality. My colleague and our former student, Arif Yusuf, has tried to explain it in terms of the palm oil story, and that explains a bit of it, but not much. That's my understanding of it. So here's my hypothesis. There's been no increase in inequality since, let's say, since the Asian financial crisis. No increase. What's happened is that Susanas has gotten better at capturing the people at the top end of the distribution. These Gini coefficients, by the way, are very, very sensitive to what happens at the extremes of the distribution, the very rich and the very poor, which is why, by the way, using changes in inequality to explain what happens to poverty incidence is completely misguided, because it's changes in the neighborhood of the poverty line that are relevant for changes in poverty, not changes in the extremes. But anyway, so there's my hypothesis. Susanas has gotten better at capturing the top end of the distribution. Does that make sense? I have no idea. Does that make sense?
Thanks very much, Peter. And that's a great topic for any potential PhD student listening to this seminar. Peter, look, I don't know the Susanas data well, and Arif Yusuf clearly does, but others here know it well too, Faraman, Buddy and others. My sense is when you get a 10 percentage point increase in the Gini, which is what happened from roughly 1998 to about 2014, that's an order of magnitude so large that my strong suspicion is there was an increase in inequality, but you're absolutely right. The top and bottom end never properly computed, and it could be BPS is getting better. The old joke used to be under Soeharto, when they used Susanas and numerators by mistake on a Soeharto member family, they dropped them and moved on. So who knows? But thanks, Peter, for the question. Did you want to add something? No. Thanks, Sarah.
Well, so thank you so much, Hal and Donny, for this very interesting talk. Please join me in thanking both of them for giving us.
Thanks very much, everybody, and appreciate your comments and participation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. It's an interesting experience, doing both the live and the online.